I wasn't expecting the light to be so bright. I was like, woo, that's a whole lot of light. Well, hello everyone. My name is Shania Patrick, and I am the manager of the Adult Learning Department here at the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library. So it is my great pleasure to welcome you, and I want you to know that this is going to be a fascinating conversation. So before we begin, and on behalf of DC Public Library, we thank you for making MLK Library part of your Saturday afternoon in the district. I also want to thank our partners at the DC Public Library Foundation for their support of programming for all ages. It's through their support that the first 50 registrants of today's event will receive a complimentary copy of Say Their Names, How Black Lives Came to Matter in America. I know, even though I work in the library and technically like all the books are free because you better return them, but to have a book that you can keep in your own home, what? You can't tell me nothing. So, yes. Now, since the murder of George Floyd, MLK Library has played host to authors, activists, and artists who show his murder as a tipping point to the conversation on race in America and inspiration in their work. Today, through this book, journalists Curtis Brown, Michael Cotman, Patrice Gaines, Nick Charles, and Keith Harrison bring a historical context to the murder of George Floyd. And, I skipped something. Ensuring we remember those that preceded George Floyd and, sadly, those that followed him at the hands of police violence. We are thrilled to have 4 of those 5 authors with us today. Well, we have 3 today. Okay, I'm like 1, 2, 3, 4. All right. So, which one is missing?
Michael Cotman, he's ill, so he can't make it.
And Curtis Bunn.
Curtis Bunn is in Atlanta.
Yeah, he had an event already scheduled because this event got changed. So.
Okay, so I don't know if I have everybody. I have Patrice, Michael, and Nick on my list.
I'm Nick, and that's Keith.
Okay.
Michael's not
And that's
here.
Keith.
Well, that's
All
G
right.
Keith.
Don't confuse it.
Don't confuse the people. That's G Keith.
Wonderful, wonderful. Now, thank you so much for that. So we are going to start with the lovely Miss Patrice. So,
Okay.
Patrice
start with
Gaines,
you.
author of the best-selling memoir
she's reading
"Laughing
about
in the Dark" and "Moments of Grace." Patrice was a Washington Post reporter for 16 years, earning a Soros Justice Media Fellowship to write columns about the impact of incarceration on the Black community. This Pulitzer Prize finalist has spoken and taught in prison and jails following her own experience in incarceration, and today is a proud justice advocate and abolitionist. Please welcome Patrice Gaines.
Thank you. Thank you.
Next, we have Nick Charles, Chief Culture Critic for National Public Radio. Served as a reporter and writer for the Daily News, People Magazine, The Washington Post, and ESPN's The Undefeated. He was editor-in-chief of AOL Black Voices and vice president of digital content for BET.com. Please welcome Nick Charles. A lecturer in journalism at George Washington University, Keith Harrington previously taught at American and Howard Universities, following his 23 years as an investigative reporter, editor and newsroom manager at the Washington Post. While at the Post, Keith was twice nominated for the Pulitzer Prize in Journalism. Welcome, Keith Harrison. And to lead us in this conversation, we are thrilled to welcome back Keith Alexander, Crime in Courts. But wait, there's more. Reporter with the Washington Post, Keith won the Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting after a year-long investigation into fatal police shootings called Final Force. Before joining the Post in 2001, Keith wrote for USA Today, Business Week, and the Dayton Daily News. So, Keith, you're going to take it away.
We'll take it away.
And you guys are going to enjoy. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Can you all hear me? Okay, very good. Thank you all for coming out. This is going to be a very exciting and very interesting conversation. I don't know if you all had a chance to read this book. I got it when it first came out. It's dog-eared, as you can see, and highlighted like the old black folks' Bible back in the day. And it's a great read. And it's a read that has, a lot of receipts, meaning they're not just telling you things. They're showing you. They're proving what they are talking about. And I encourage each of you all to pick up this book. It's called Say Their Names, How Black Lives Come to Matter in America. And first of all, I want you all to thank you very much for answering a question that always came to me, especially on social media. As someone who covers crime, I'm always getting someone say, well, I thought Black Lives Matter. I thought Black Lives Matter, it's black on black crime or individuals are killing each other. And some people throw out that line almost as if it's a cliche, right? Or almost even tongue in cheek. Explain to the audience where the expression Black Lives actually came from and why it came into being.
Go ahead, Patrice. You're the star.
Oh, you want me to start? Well, it was after.
You guys can hear her?
Can you hear me? And you all fill in as well. But it was first mentioned on social media after Trayvon Martin was killed. And not necessarily as a full movement, but to say that Black lives have not, up to this point, been given the value of other lives, and that we need to say Black lives matter. But it resonated as we continue to see a pattern of the devaluation of Black lives and the incidents of particularly young black people being killed by police. And that's when it began not only to resonate with those in the United States, but as you saw after the murder of George Floyd, it resonated with people around the world. That people understood it wasn't just also about one issue, it was really about the inequity of life in this country in the many ways, and that's what we talk about here is how that term came to matter is because people recognize it wasn't just about the murders of black people, it was about the lack of health care in certain communities, the lack of grocery stores and good foods in certain communities. It was about all the many ways in which black life is devalued. And that's what we tried to cover in this book, is to write chapters about as many of those issues as we could.
And this is a great segue for Keith to talk a little bit about, because one of the issues that I believe this came out of was the fact that police officers and, as was mentioned in the book, wannabe police officers, security guards, like the George Zimmerman, were not being held accountable. Charges were not being filed when unarmed individuals were being killed by police officers and wannabe police officers, and that's part of the reason what sparked it. So, well, look, black lives actually matter. When people are killed on the street, chances are somebody's going to be arrested. But when the police officers or security guards were killing people, no one was being arrested, and I think that's was part of why this came about. Can you talk a little bit about your chapter about policing? You talk in your chapter really also not only about national incidents of police brutality and killing of individuals, but also even about a local Prince George's case that I wrote about. But talk a little bit about that case and about what you found.
It's a case that happened, 3 decades ago. It happened at about 5 p.m. in the afternoon on a weekday. A young man was working on a construction job in Northern Virginia someplace. He lived in Prince George's County. On his way home from work, he had a couple of drinks. I'm not sure. I wasn't able to determine what it was. It doesn't really matter what it was. What matters is that on his way home, he was stopped by police who said the police officer said he saw the driver swerving, so he pulled him over about a half a mile from the home that he lived in with his mother and brother at the time. he was wearing, because it was summertime, it was like in first week of June, he was wearing just gym shorts, underwear under the gym shorts, no shirt, because it was hot and he'd been working in construction. Police officer stopped him, I think it was Capitol Heights Police, District Heights police officer stopped him, searched him, didn't see anything, handcuffed him, put him in the front seat of the patrol car. A Prince George's County police officer arrived to back up the District Heights officer. So while the young man was sitting in the front seat of the Capitol Heights police car with his hands cuffed behind his back, the Prince George's County officer and the Capitol Heights police officer say they saw what appeared them to be the man had somehow, this is their story, had somehow, first of all, hidden a handgun in his sweatpants, his sweat shorts. During the search, it wasn't found, and that even though his hands were cuffed behind his back, they said that he had somehow maneuvered to get the gun and point it through the window at the officers, and they shot him about 25 times. He died, again, about a half mile from his home. The state's attorney in Prince George's County at the time, Alex Williams, and he actually ran on the theme that he was going to hold police in Prince George's County accountable for these things. I interviewed him for the book, and he's now a retired federal judge, by the way, and he swore. He said, look, I put my best people on this case. And all the grand jury that he presented the case to did was they recommend that police in Prince George's County get better training on how to search people. That was their recommendation.
And this was, I'm sorry, 30 years ago, right?
30 years ago.
Okay.
I talked to his mother, who essentially has made, as any of us who have children, you can imagine, that's her life's work now. I mean, she has, from the time that this happened, essentially tried to get someone to reopen the case to listen to it. By the way, the Prince George's County police officer who did fire some of those 25 rounds at the young man went on to kill another person in Prince George's County, and he wasn't held accountable for that either. And one of the reasons that they weren't held accountable, and one of the reasons I reached back to so far, and even though it wasn't far enough, is because this has been going on for a long time. Those of us who are a little older know that. Some people who are not as old as some of us in here don't realize that. They think, oh, it was George Floyd, it was Trayvon Martin, and all this started happening. But it's been actually happening even further back than the 3 decades with this case in Prince George's County. His name, the guy, by the way, the young man's name who was killed while handcuffed is Archie Elliott. But I wanted to use that case, one, to make the point that, a couple of points. One, the impact that shooting a black person has on our community, because it happens at a rate, we only know this because some of the work that you all did, Keith, at the Post, because essentially from about 2015 to 2021, through like those 6 years, a black person, a black man or a woman is shot by a law enforcement, shot and killed by a law enforcement officer every 38 hours in this country. Every 38 hours. So think about that. That's like 3 cycles of going to work, going to sleep. Not even 3 cycles. It happens that frequently. But I also wanted to demonstrate how, the impact that it has on the broader community. Families are left behind. And it also demonstrated that even when the details of shootings were so outrageous, that police officers weren't being held accountable. And in this case, again, one of those officers who was not held accountable went on to kill another person about 3 years later. And there's a reason for that. I'm not going to dominate this, but there's a reason why officers, it's so hard to hold them accountable, is because any union members in here of any particular union, police officers have a fantastic union. And they do a hell of a job of protecting their membership because, well, that's what unions are supposed to do. And whether I agree with what they do or not, they do a hell of a job and have done a hell of a job of protecting their membership. After George Floyd, for instance, let me go back even further. Early 70s, the state of Maryland was the first state in this country to establish what its various names, what they called the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights. that essentially created a special class for people in law enforcement that gave them rights that none of us had. For instance, say Patrice and I conspired to do any kind of crime, whatever the crime was. If police got on to us and were investigated and wanted to detain us, and wanted to charge us, they'd come pick us up, take us back to the office, charge us. But what this Bill of Rights, the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, did in the state of Maryland and 17 other jurisdictions, including the District of Columbia, it allowed a lot of things, including if Patrice and I were law enforcement officers, we could wait up to 2 weeks before any police officer could talk to us, which would, of course, give Patrice and I time to get our stories together, collaborate on what the best defense would be, and that kind of thing. And there's also a whole lot of, a whole laundry list of other rights that this special class that police officers got because of the bill in Maryland. I'll just say the last thing about that. The state of Maryland, after George Floyd's murder, by the way, repealed that Bill of Rights. However, there's a link between the two that's important. Those 17 jurisdictions, including, again, the District of Columbia, that have some version of the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, those 17 jurisdictions are responsible for about 54% of all the fatal shootings that police officers do. And the reason is because they know that they can't be held accountable in those states. And so they're going to be more likely to pull their weapon and use deadly force than they are in states where they are more likely to be held accountable. So,
Does the name William Green mean anything to anyone here? William Green? So in 2020, your case happened how long, 30 years ago?
yes.
William Green, handcuffed, sitting in a police cruiser in District Heights, Maryland, just in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing, handcuffed, was fatally shot by a police officer. Your case happened 30 years ago. Another case very similar, just happened 3 years ago
Yeah. And again,
in Prince George's County.
and this cycle just continues and continues and continues. And by the way, about Archie Elliott, just a little detail about him. His mother was a school teacher. She taught business in a Prince George's County high school. His father was a judge. And so, a couple of the people that I picked out to use in my chapter. Now, Archie Elliott, his mother will tell you, he was no angel, but he wasn't a gangbanger. He was just a guy trying to get home to his mother and his brother. And yes, he may or may not have been swerving, but I just can't. I defy any of you to sit with your hands behind your back, stick something in the front of your pants if you have pants on, and find a way to get that thing out of your pants and then point it at somebody. It defies logic.
And they overlooked it the first time.
And they overlooked it the first time. So
One of the things that we are talking about here as police violence, folks getting shot and violated, has been happening chapter and verse for decades. Before Archie, there's Elmer Bumpers in New York. There is Abdul Luima, who was violated by the police. There is the young man, African immigrant, who got killed, 41 shots that Bruce Springsteen wrote about. So when we talk about Black Lives Matter and why we said it, it was that frustration. And the three young women who were responsible for that, after Trayvon Martin was shot by a would-be, a wannabe cop, George Zimmerman, escalated after Michael Brown got shot by police. And then all of a sudden you had all these protests. And our book also talks about, the book happens, we're writing this book during the pandemic. And we're seeing every index in this country, life expectancy, health statistics, Black folks, African Americans, Africans of other descent are at the bottom of every index. And this has been going on for decades, for more than a century. And finally, folks are like, this is not right, something has to give. And the problem when we say Black Lives Matter is not the negation of anybody else. It doesn't mean that nobody else's lives matter. It just means that in a normal day-to-day, folks think about those lives. People are considerate about those lives. And we as Black people don't see that when we get violated, when we get shot, when we go to the bank to get a loan, when we go to the doctor to get seen. All these different things have come to the fore. There was nothing that we didn't know, except now it was stark and there was a focus light on it. And as George Floyd's daughter rightly said, Daddy changed the world. Because watching that made a lot of folks just stop for a minute and say, wait a minute, this has been going on, and this is the most egregious, most recent thing. But since George Floyd has been shot, we have seen other folks have been shot.
And that leads me to my next question. After the George Floyd movement that literally went over across the world, throughout the entire world, what has changed? In your opinion, what has changed and what still needs to change?
Well, the thing about it is you can't talk your way out of anything that you actually behaved your way into. And a lot of people have been talking. A lot of people got hired as DEI folks to make their companies, corporations, public or private, more equitable. Well, we've seen over the last year, people have been pulling back on that. So the commitment level is not there. The policy changes are not there. The things that would happen in place, as Keith was saying, to hold officers accountable, to make sure that healthcare is more equitable, and that folks who live in working class and poor neighborhoods have access to stuff. Those things haven't changed. If the fundamental things that make the society run, education, don't change. Now we see what's going on with banning books, defunding libraries. You know, people are screaming, defund the police or not defund the police. They're defunding libraries. The library is a sanctuary. There are people here today because it's hot outside, people out here doing work because they're students, people coming here just to read. They're talking about defunding libraries. This is all a backlash to what happened when George Floyd got murdered.
Patrice?
I wanted to take us back because it's I think no coincidence that we're here during the Emancipation Day celebration, because I think that when you say about we can't talk our way out of this behavior, we've been behaving this way since Black people came to this country. And so for me, like, I consider myself an abolitionist because in all my work with criminal justice, as a justice advocate, I always feel like we ask the wrong questions. We always want to know how much time someone's going to get, how much punishment. But we are the people that are being punished generally, if you're poor, if you're Black, if you're brown. And so I think we need to ask ourselves, how do we get to a point where this occurs, and how do we create something different so that the future looks different than today? And so when I did the chapter on locking up Black lives, and I was really thankful that I got this opportunity to do it, because I've written a lot about criminal justice over the years, but never had the time that we had, the silent time, because it was during COVID when we had to do this. We actually could not go out like we normally do, most of us, and knock on doors. We had to try to catch people. You know how everybody was not in their office, so we had to do all this reporting at that time. But it gave me an opportunity also to really delve into connecting the dots between the stories I had done over the years. So I went all the way back to slavery and to the beginning of the first prison that was built in Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, and look at how Black people have been treated since punishment existed in this country. And so when you look at that, even looking at the first prison, which was in Philly, they didn't need prisons in the South because they had slavery. So after the Emancipation Proclamation, though, they had all of these free Black people who did not have jobs. And people were afraid. And I have a little subtitle chapter in here that says, when white people are afraid, Black people get locked up. Mm-hmm. And that's the truth. That is a pattern. We are such fearful people, some of us. And and every country doesn't do it this way, so I looked at that as well. And so since the beginning of time, when they had the first prison, the first person to be locked up was a Black man, a colored man then, he was called. Yeah. And since that time, there has never been a period where the percentage of Black people was less than the percentage of white people incarcerated, in the sense that we make up there are 2 million people incarcerated. We make up 13% of the population. We represent almost 40% of the people who are incarcerated. And it has been that way since the beginning of time. And it frustrates me in a way that so many of us have come to believe that that's the way it should be. And so that the only question we ask ourselves when somebody commits a crime is, how much time should they get? Well, I sometimes have to wonder, how much time should the people get that created this system? At what point do we look at how do we create something different? And so in my chapter, like one of the things I did, I centered it on Philadelphia because it had the first prison, but also because they've received a lot of money to reduce the population of black people. And so they have a lot of records to look at what they've done. They haven't been fully successful, but at least I was able to look at their records. One of the young men that I talked to was a young guy who went to prison at age 15 and got out at age 38. And when I spoke to him, he had been out for 3 weeks. And just to show you how people are treated. Now, when he went in, and I think I have it right, that he's the person who went in because someone had threatened to kill him, and when he saw the person, he shot them first. He was afraid, and he shot this person. So when he got out and he went to his sister's house, had a nice place to go live, got a job and everything. But to show you the kinds of things people have to deal with when they first get out, he said his family immediately want to throw a party, to celebrate his freedom. And so his sister took him, they were gone all day, left like maybe 11 in the day, got back late at night. And when he came back, he realized he had left the water in the bathroom running all day long. Why? Because when he was in prison, water turned off automatically. And so we have people that get out and we want them to just get a job and go straight, but they are dealing with the smallest things that you cannot even imagine that we take just for granted, that they have to do, how to get an ATM card, how to use an ATM card, how to pump gas, how to, apply for a job online, how to even operate different computers. And yet we ask folks to do this and wonder why our recidivism rate is so high.
And this young man was 15. He was a juvenile.
Yeah.
He was a kid.
And was tried as an
And
adult.
tried as an adult.
Which
And
we
so-
do too, which a lot of countries do not do. I mean, we do things to our children, we do things to human beings that other countries do not do. And a remarkable thing is they have less crime. And there's an abolitionist that I love because I always remember her name's Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and what she says is where life is precious, life is precious. It's a very simple thing. But so if we approach life from the beginning, and even now with Black Lives Matter, if life is precious, we would be saying every life is precious, and we'd create something totally different than we have today.
Nick, I definitely want to come to you because Nick wrote a fascinating chapter about the black church and involved in this movement, and we want to get to that. Before we do, I want to talk to Patrice. Patrice, you have a unique background
Oh, yes.
that a lot of other people are laughing. They know what I'm talking about already. Look at that.
I should have
The audience.
mentioned it.
Oh,
Those people are related to me.
okay. That's how you bring family and stuff like that, But you possess something
Yeah.
in your background that a lot of journalists do not have. Can you
Right.
talk a little bit about that and how has that
Yeah.
affected your work?
I have a unique relationship with the police.
Yes.
When-
The criminal
when-
justice system.
Criminal justice system. Yeah, when I was 21, I was a heroin abuser and on my way to becoming an addict. And I was busted in Charlotte, North Carolina with possession of heroin, and possession with intent to distribute, and possession of a needle and syringe, which are felonies. And so I was facing all this time. I went to jail. I was very fortunate. It was before mandatory sentencing and the harsher drug laws. So I was able to plea and got 5 years probation. But one of the things I knew, was the night that I was arrested, I was not a drug dealer. I was a drug user. I didn't have that much. I had personal drugs. It just so happens some friends had brought the drugs from D.C. So the police came up with the scenario that they wanted, which was that these were drug dealers bringing me drugs to sell. And they would not get off of that scenario. My bond was $100,000, and I always remember that Angela Davis's bond was $100,000, and trust me, I was not Angela Davis. So, I know what police can do, what they can do to you. Also, I thought that I did well because I got 5 years probation. What I didn't realize at the time was that once you become a convicted felon, in this country, this is not a country that forgives you for your crime, especially if you're a convicted felon. So I was a single mom. To find a job, I always had to lie about my past, because if they saw it on the paper, that was it. All the way up until when I became a reporter at the Post, and I still lied. Eventually was faced with where I had to tell the truth, and remarkably, they ended up keeping me, but don't give them any kudos for that, because they also took me off. They did not give me raises after that. It was more like, here, you have your job, what more you want? So it was that kind of thing. They did hire somebody else, Nathan McCall, after me, who had a record. So I like to think that they learned something. But one of the ways in which it changed me was later, when there was this major crime called the 8th and H crew, is what the police called it, and they said that these 8 guys, well, they said there were more than that, a gang of young black people attacked a woman in their neighborhood and killed her viciously. I didn't believe them. I didn't believe them because I knew they could come up with a scenario, and if they wanted to, they would not get off that scenario. And so ended up following that case all the way to the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court ruled against us, as you know, you were there. But at least there were 2, it wasn't a unanimous decision. But I understand what police are able to do if we are not watching what they do. Yeah.
Nick, talk about your chapter about the church and the Black Lives Matter movement and the impact of the church, or lack thereof.
Well, it wasn't about a lack thereof. The church has led on so many good things. The church is a refuge. The church is a revolutionary space for black folks, always has been. When we could go nowhere else, we went to the church. But the reality is that the history and the telling of that involvement of civil rights activists and the church, we forget that it wasn't the great men, Martin and other ministers. It was women, black women, who are always at the forefront of the struggle. People like Ruby Sales, who's in my book, in my chapter, I should say. And here we come, the last part of this, early part of this century, and it's young black women who were leading the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, these are the people who are not divorced from faith, but they were not using the church in the sense of the way the church used to be.
How were they using the church then?
They had faith, but the church would give them sanctuary. Like people forget, during the Michael Brown demonstrations, the church would open the sanctuary. There were ministers who would pray with them, but they were not leading. And we were always accustomed to the ministers in front, Jesse, the Reverend Al, other folks leading these Martin leading these the activists. Well, the reality was now it has changed. The activists are female, they're younger, they're queer, and they're not always accepted by the church. But they found a way also using technology. A lot of this came on social media. This wasn't concentrated into one group of leaders. It was all over the place. That's why it's exploded globally into Europe, exploded in Australia, in Africa. People were able to tap into that because there was no finite way that people could hide information. They can just put it out there and folks would decide what they thought they wanted to do with it. I'm not somebody here who's here to stamp on the church. I'm just here to say the church has retreated in certain ways. The church has gotten comfortable. The church at the beginning and the end of the day is an institution. And the first thing for institutions is survival. And survival means, how do we fund this? How do we keep going? Well, some churches have forgotten their mission and mandate, which is to give support and to the community. To give the community, make sure that when the community is feeling oppressed or feeling upset, go around and make sure that's happening. It's really telling now, in the most recent aspect of what's going on in Kentucky with those 2 young Justins. The 2 Justin boys, that's the future. And the thing about them is, somebody 2 days ago, one of the Tennessee, my bad. I'm thinking of the mass shooting in Kentucky. That's my problem. In Tennessee, one of the senators, white senators, was saying, well, I take my lead from God. And one of the Justins says, don't use God to mask all your racism. Don't use God to mask all your hate. And of course, as we know, anybody who can speak like that knows the Bible. And he quoted scripture. So these young people who have grown up with parents who were in the church, they themselves may have not been as deep in the church, but they know what the value is of the church. But they have taken that value and said, we're not going to be silent. We're not going to just take our time and, we shall overcome. We're going to utilize all the tools we have now to make sure, if nothing else, people hear us. And that's what the Black Lives Matter movement did, was embolden young people like that. These guys are in their 20s. They grew up with that. And so that's their mandate, that's their mission. They don't disparage the church, they don't discard the church, but they understand that there are limits to where the church is willing to go.
And is it also because that it is a new day, and churches, their tax exempt status, especially if they're passive, if there's a pastor out there, could be at fault.
Well, look,
could be jeopardized.
The former guy who, before the president we have, would convene something and would sign some Civil Rights Act, and there would be 10 to 15 ministers, mostly men, standing around because they were getting something for that. Whether or not they believed in what his policy might have been, they know that, we need to continue this operation. We need to continue this corporatized kind of activity around the church. And we can't rely on people in the pews because there are less and less people in pews. And the most of the people still in pews are older black women who keep the church going. The physical structure, the people who are keeping people coming through the doors, people who are supporting the minister. They can't financially support the church. So the church, unfortunately, in the guise of some of our ministers, have decided to become more political than they would have been, even with their tax exempt status. And now we see the rise of certain kinds of churches, from white churches and even black churches, that are totally antithetical to what Jesus would have taught.
But also, you mentioned Reverend Al. Al Sharpton, never a pastor, minister, but never a pastor.
Never had a church.
Barber. Was he ever? I don't know. Was he ever a pastor?
He had a pastor. He has a church down in North Carolina, and Reverend Barber is the one. I said there are probably others, but he's one person that I've talked to, and very few others who are like, it's about the poor.
It's about the what?
The poor.
The poor.
It's what Jesus. Who did Jesus minister to? Who did Jesus look out for? The poor. So when Reverend Barber is always on the poor people's campaign and making poor folks and working class folks, and not just black folks, because they're white working class folks and white poor folks who are getting the same shaft, who are getting the same kind of dismissive attitude from the government and from folks who should know better. So when you have Reverend Barber, who's joining him? Who's co-signing what he's saying every day in the pews when we're talking about these mega churches and we're talking about these ministers who are talking about a wealth that Jesus wants to spread, but they're getting wealthy and the poor are being neglected.
I know we do have questions in the audience, and there was a microphone going around. If you have any questions, just please raise your hand. We'll make sure the microphone. We got a question in the back, and we have a question up front.
Is yours on?
Back in front.
That guy.
First of all, I wanted to say thank you for coming out. I definitely enjoyed this conversation. It could be a 2, 3, 4 hour conversation. But just a couple comments I want to make, and then a quick question. When Keith was talking about Prince George's County, I was thinking that it's ironic that these things happened there, because last I checked, I think the first or second amount of black people who are educated, who have money, live in Prince George's County. Okay, and for these things to be happening there, it's kind of ironic, if I may use that word.
Right, Prince George's County at one time had the largest concentration of affluent African Americans,
That's what
up
I'm
until like last year or two.
Yeah.
I just want to, my question is, and if maybe all of y'all can answer this, what do y'all think about police reform or defunding the police? I know there are two different things, but which one would you recommend?
I gotta say, I am a nephew of a police officer who was a police officer for 45 years and drew his gun twice. And he used to tell me, you gotta respect people, no matter who they are, where they are in their circumstances. And also, you can't expect the police to do everything. And one of the things about, I think, the defund the police movement is that people are saying, not defund the police and just eliminate them, but there are things the police should not be doing on a daily basis. police will tell you the biggest thing, and I covered cops years ago, will tell you the most frightening calls are the domestic violence calls, because they don't know what they're walking into. It's the call where the mother calls and says, my son is acting erratically. They don't know what they're walking into, because most of the time, these are folks who may have mental illness or may have whatever going on at that moment. And you don't want to police, because your response is to bring physical force. You need people who can bring skills and experience in how do you bring the situation down?
Yeah.
How do you calm it down?
De-escalate.
De-escalation, because that's not what the police is about. The police are about. They're about making sure things get done. But not every call, and a lot of regular calls that cops get, are those calls where they don't need to have force brought. So the reality is, how do we take some of those funds that we may do the 45 police and buy all these military hardware that cops have to bring in folks with social services, folks with mental health experience, to de-escalate those situations and therefore save lives.
It's the retraining of police officers. I think that's what people are actually calling for, is to have officers trained in a different way to know that they can recognize, like you said, recognize someone who's having a mental illness
Breakdown, yeah.
situation, or someone who is trying to die by suicide, by cop, or de-escalate.
Or somebody who just had the worst day ever, and they just, they're frustrated, they're angry, and they don't really want to lash out at anybody else, but because they're acting in a certain way, somebody makes a phone call, the police show up, it rises to another level, he won't put up their hands, won't walk back, and next thing you know, it's an officer-involved shooting.
Let me say, about police reform.
The irony.
I don't like ugly.
Man, it's important to know the history of policing and incarceration in this country. So, I grew up in D.C. and Northeast. Any of you, especially the black men in this, who grew up either in D.C. or in an urban area, how many times did this happen to you when you were hanging out, say, with your friends, just standing around, really doing nothing? A police car stops by and says, "What are y'all doing? You can't stay here." You know where that came from? Slave patrols in the 1700s, which essentially was when policing in this country started. And slave patrols began in South Carolina because slave owners were outnumbered by enslaved people, and they were afraid. They were always afraid because, contrary to these pictures that have been painted of slavery in this country, it wasn't huge plantations with wire fences up keeping people enslaved on those properties. Enslaved people could walk around. And then they figured out it's too many of them, they outnumber us, we have to figure out something we can do to control them. So slave patrols were created, and their job was that they saw, 2 or 3 black people walking around, stop them, search them, make sure they weren't hiding any weapons, ask them what they were doing. If you were suspicious of them, they pick them up, take them back to the plantation. It's the same kind of stuff those summers when you were standing out on the corners with your boys, and the patrol car pulls up and says, "What are y'all doing? You can't stand here like this," even when you're not doing nothing. And I mention that to say this about police reform. While I was working on this book, I talked to a lot of experts about police reform, including people who worked on police reform in the District of Columbia. And what this one professor at Georgetown University said to me, she said, "You've done a lot of research. How many black people have been killed by police in the past 6 years?" And at the time, it was just over 6,000 people, over 6 years, 6,000 black people. And she said, even if we could somehow magically start police forces over tomorrow, it would still be about 10 times that number of black people who died because of healthcare inequities in this country. And her point was, it's not just about policing, and it's not just about incarceration, it's not just about healthcare inequities. It's about systemic racism in this country that infects the entire country. We've been doing this for about more than a year and going around talking about this. And sometimes we agree on this, sometimes we don't. I like to say as we get to the end, and we're not at the end, I tell people, it's this, especially when it was during the last general election, I would say this book is about what normalcy is in this country, and it hasn't worked for us. You know, this is about normalcy. So did we really want to get, Trump was awful, so we wanted to get back to normal with Joe Biden. But this is what that normalcy stands for, the stuff that we've written about in this book. So police reform does need to be done, and I think, a lot of it does have to do with training. I'll stop after this.
And then I want to say something.
A lot of European countries, police officers are trained for up to 3 years. In the United States, it's anywhere from 6 weeks to 6 months. This country, it treats police officers not any better than they treat teachers. Teachers who have the most important job in this country don't get paid well. Police don't get paid well, and they're not trained.
And
Yeah.
I'll make this short, but of course, once they get arrested, they're going to prison. Because generally, and when a black person gets arrested anyway, what happens after that is the treatment is much harsher than what would happen if a white person got, so they're going to get the higher sentence, the higher bond, everything. But when you talked about Europe, so in my chapter, I looked at how other countries treat crime as far as incarceration. And you have countries like Germany and in the Netherlands where people aren't sentenced to the number of years that we sentence people. You saw where the guy got 70 years for spitting on police after he had also, of course, been had domestic violence charges. But they don't do things like that in other countries. One of the other things they don't do, and when we talk about systemic racism, it is pointed out to me that there aren't that many black people in these countries as well. But nevertheless, one of the things that they do is like person might get arrested, locked up, but the guard knows that person's name. They aren't given a number. They eat meals together. The guards eat meals with them. In many cases, they have their own bedrooms. Everything looks totally different because what they recognize is that most of these people are going to return to society. And so why not work on actual rehabilitation, and why not get to know them so that you therefore know what their treatment should be, what's the issue, get them some therapy. When they return, that they're returning better than they were when they were out. We don't do that. We don't do that at all. The other thing, just a little anecdote about a friend of mine who's from Brooklyn went to Amsterdam on a trip where he was looking at the different facilities that these countries have and the different judicial systems. So he was in Amsterdam and he went in a little store, and he said when he walked in the storekeeper looked a little nervous to him, and he thought, being from Brooklyn and all in the U.S., I know what this is all about, this white guy looking at him like this. So he asked the guy, you got a problem? And the guy said, yeah. He said, I got something I need to go do. I was getting ready to close up, but I tell you what, if you'll get what you want and just put the money on the counter, and here's the key, and told him lock the door and where to drop the keys. Needless to say, my friend stood there astonished and did everything he was told to do. But he said what he was left with was all these questions about what kind of country then, what kind of system they create when they look at a black man like that, and how that system they created is different than the system that we create when we look at a black man differently. So.
We have a question here, and I do often wonder if our police officers, at least in the D.C. area, lived in the neighborhoods where they worked, instead of driving an hour from parts of Virginia or parts of Maryland on the outskirts. If they actually lived in Ward 8 and Ward 7 and knew these individuals, these young men, on a first name basis, as opposed to coming out an hour away, just coming to work and then leaving.
Well,
I often wonder about that.
Well, and I often wonder why success has to mean moving out there. if we had created a society in which that wasn't what meant. Success meant creating a community that was better, so you didn't have to move.
Right. Yes, ma'am.
I'm from North Carolina, and I got out of there as soon as I could.
What part of North Carolina?
High Point.
Oh yeah, I know where High Point is.
And I moved up here, and I volunteered at Howard Hospital when the crack epidemic was at its worst and the AIDS epidemic had started. And I met a baby, and I was allowed to adopt her. And
Hey.
I have learned so much over the 33 years I've had her, because when she was about 10, we were at CVS, because that was the only place that had it up on Connecticut Avenue near Chevy Chase. And
Can you
cops
speak up a little
and
bit
police
more?
officers came in and grabbed her because I was getting her prescription, and they thought she was stealing something. And I had to go to 2D and fight because they were going to take her. They had her handcuffed. And she looked like somebody, a suspect. And she had braids. And I was like, you can't do this. You can't do this. And I had to fight with the police over that. And the other thing that I wanted to say is, in November, I was in critical condition, and I was taken to Howard Hospital. And they saved my life. I was in intensive care for a month. And what broke my heart is I was conscious enough to hear how many people, when they came in, that were not African American, and they would not stay. They would not stay at Howard Hospital because most of the doctors and the nurses were. And they saved my life. And it broke my heart because my parents, my mother called, and she would fight with them on the phone. She's elderly. And they would not talk to her because she was being so racist. She said, "Do you not have a white doctor there?" And it crushes me.
Yeah.
And it needs to change. It really does.
Thank you for that. Thank
Yeah,
you for
thank
that.
you.
Question in the
There's a,
back.
there's a question in the back. Thank you for that, ma'am.
Yeah. Thank you
Question for
That's
that.
very-
While we're going to that question, can you talk a little bit about how this book even came together? Because there's so many examples of police brutality.
take that?
How did you decide which ones to leave out, which ones to include, and how does it even came about?
Well, it never started off as a police brutality book. Again, it started out as a book looking at all the issues that we've been talking about: education, healthcare, policing, the church, and how uniformly those things have always existed. And people don't think about them because they don't have to. People are trying to live their lives every day, so they're not looking at statistics, they're not looking at the data that we accumulated. And so we were just trying to let folks know that we see this, and this is why certain things happen. As Keith was saying, people see, every so often somebody gets shot by the police, but there are a lot of cases where people get shot by the police, you never make the news. As much as there's 36 to 40% of black folks who get shot by police, there's 6% of other people who get shot by police, who are white and Latino, and sometimes Asian, who get shot by police. Those cases don't make the news. And again, some of the same issues are involved. What are police responding to? What do they see when they roll up on you? What do they think you are?
Okay.
Are you a suspect? Are you, a predator? Or when they roll up, are they thinking, okay, how can I help this person? What situation is this person in that I can help them get out of, at least temporarily, till I can get somebody who's an expert in that area to deal with that.
We have a question back here.
I do want to say too that we do, we have a chapter on health care. We talk about education, the gap in education. We talk about, so there are all other issues in here about politics, and so we tried to cover as many of the issues that, issues of inequity.
And the second volume is going to cover media
Right,
and
right.
sports and all the stuff we didn't talk about.
And I wanted you to know also that it also is a book I think we leave on a note of hope in each of our chapters, because what we found were all these young activists that are out there doing the work. It's amazing to me the number of people that are out there now. Well, you see some of them protesting, but we talk about that even whether it's in the church, whether it's about police reform, whether it's about mass incarceration and reform of that system, but the people who are actually out there doing the work. So we like to think too that we give you some encouragement for the future.
Yes, ma'am, in the back.
Oh, thank you so much for, first of all, writing this book, and also for DC Public Library sponsoring this event. It needs to be sponsored throughout the country. And as the gentleman said here, the United States is really not normal. And this is what I want the authors to speak on. It's actually toxic. We must tell our young people as such, this is nothing new. So if we tell them the truth, I think they can better understand how to navigate and how maybe not to navigate in the United States. We're black and brown people. The world is black and brown. We can live anywhere in the world. So since the United States decides not to be civilized, we need to decide what we're going to do, and especially the children.
And that's why I also encourage children to grow up and travel, so they can see that there are other ways of living and of doing things, of dealing with issues. Yeah.
One of the things you have to realize too, and I'm going to push back a little bit, is that as somebody who was born somewhere else, I was born in Europe, grew up in the Caribbean, came here, went to school, is that when you travel around, you realize that as much as it might be toxic here, other places have their own toxicity in different ways. You have to realize that some countries exported their slaves, and therefore they didn't have what America had, where people were on plantations. There are no plantations in England. There are no plantations in France. There are no plantations in Belgium. So the reality is they are just as culpable in certain ways. They held the same ideology, but because this country is supposed to be the shining beacon on the hill, this is supposed to be the place you can come and be yourself and make a life, the American dream. And for some of us, it has never been realized. And that's the reality.
Thank you for that. We have some questions over here, real quick. Yes, sir.
Hello. I want to thank everybody for being in this space today. And I have a quick, I went to Morehouse. So I think I share a similar feeling of, as black people in America, we make one step forward to go 3 steps back. And my question leads to your comment earlier about how do we measure the progression of black people in this country, because too often we go 1 step forward to come 3 steps back. And even, I bring this up because yesterday me and my mom were talking about how black women are one of the most educated groups of people in America, yet they carry the highest student loan debt, they're the lowest paid on jobs, they have to go through so much systematic racism, in corporate America, in corporate, worlds. And so how can we hold on to a success like that when we also have to deal with the scrutiny and the negativity that comes along with it? So just my question is, how are we measuring the progression of African Americans in this country, in education, in the church, in the policing system, in all of these entities of America?
Keith, can you take that?
Yes, Keith.
I read that because I heard you say that several times, taking 2 steps forward, 3 steps back.
Yeah,
and it was just,
I mean, it's true. We did something with this book that normally would take people up to 2 years to do the reporting and writing. The publisher said, I'll buy this because there's going to be a lot of these books that happen, that come out after that summer, after George Floyd was killed. If we get ours out first, we'll buy the book. And so we did this in about six months' time. And before we were even finished, things were changing. Like, for instance, because my expertise is in criminal justice, I knew, because of what the police unions have done historically, that as soon as they could, we were going to start getting a whole lot more stories in the media about crime and how awful crime was, and how police officers were leaving the departments because now there were too much scrutiny and they couldn't recruit people, and we needed more police officers. Damn it didn't even take a year after George Floyd for that stuff to start happening. And it's all these people who are reporters, and have been and still are in most cases, know those stories just don't fall out of the sky. It's because people are calling them and saying, usually police officers who decide when they want to leak stuff, all of a sudden all these crime stories start getting committed. It's like, yeah, I grew up in D.C. My oldest sister, this isn't being filmed, right? My oldest sister who lived, anyway, she doesn't even want, she doesn't even want to leave her house now because what she has seen and what she's been presented with, especially on local news, local TV news, is that it's not safe. And they created that. So yes, there was going to be, let's defund the police, which is really just reappropriating some of the money that's in their operating budget to other agencies. All of that stuff was supposed to happen. In the first place it was supposed to happen was in Minneapolis. Never happened. Never happened. And we have taken steps back. The mayor of this city wants to hire more police officers all of a sudden. But
one of the things
let me just finish this last thing. Nobody wants to take the time, for instance, to go down to police headquarters and walk into all the offices and see how many uniformed people are performing jobs that civilians could be doing. And those officers could be out in the streets. This is the same. This stuff happens all the time. It just recycles, and because people aren't in places to help hold them accountable, they just it happens over and over and over.
But some of those officers don't need to be out in the streets. Nick, what were you going to say?
No, I was going to say one of the things you talk about 2 steps back, forward, and then 3 back is that black women are relentless, and the good thing is they don't give up. And as they are now 50 to 60% of people in college, they're going to be 75 and 80. Come in about 5 to 10 years. We have a whole educated class of black women who will be running this country one day. And we have to prepare for that because we're not finding black men in colleges. Young white men are not going to college as much as they were going. And so it's up to these group of women who are on campuses from Howard to the Ivies to the state colleges to make a difference. Yes, they still have to battle to do twice as much to just get recognized. They make 79 cents on the dollar. All of that is true. It's going to change. And, one of the things that we as folks always have to understand, it doesn't happen overnight. It's patience.
Oh my God.
I know, but the reality is, if you are in the struggle, there are things you can point in your own life or in your family's life that 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago were not possible. And those are the things you keep holding on to, knowing that there's an army of black women coming to save all of us.
I'm dependent on you.
Yeah, there you go. We have one question over here, and we're going to close it out with a question right here, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
First, thank you to the DC Public Library for hosting this, and thank you very much for collaborating on this project. And thank you for actually highlighting more symptoms. This is a symptom. You spoke of food deserts. You talk about healthcare disparities. I could draw a straight line from all of these symptoms right back to slavery, the failed Reconstruction. And we could talk about symptoms all day, but until we get to the root of the problem, which I feel is the lack of the political will, the political capital to address reparations. Until we have a reparations conversation that involves truth and reconciliation with the people, because the politicians understand it. That's why you get backlash from the DeSantis of the world. When we make any type of progress, it has to be squashed and extinguished, because if we get any type of conversation about truth and reconciliation and have a real history, not the Daughters of the Revolution history, our history. We are American freedmen. We are not necessarily descendants of slaves. We are American freedmen. We were called this by Lincoln. And we have carried the banner of freedom, not only here, but across the world. So how do we get beyond buying into masking symptoms and get to the root of why we're here and talk about this country's history, why we are chained at the bottom? No matter how much education we get, black folks is the floor of capitalism. There's big money in having these prisons that house us. That's that's where they put them in West Virginia. So when they come out the coal mines, they could go man the prison system that house us. We are the floor of capitalism, and we're chained there. And until we talk about the real problems, we're going to keep writing these books and talk about symptoms. I mean, maybe it's just me, but what do you feel about reparations, and how do we speak to America to let them know it's just not about a big check for unpaid labor? And I mean unpaid, it wasn't free. The bill is still due. It's 400 plus years behind. That means you got a lot of interest.
Okay, thank you. Patrice, will you answer that question?
Well, I just,
Thank you for that.
yeah, I just was going to say, I agree. We're talking really about the fundamental foundation of this country and demanding that the truth be told. This story that we've been telling ourselves. So in 2026, this country will celebrate its 250th anniversary. They're already gearing up on how they who continue to perpetuate this story are going to celebrate it. We need to show up in a different way with a different story, different demands. We need to tell the truth. There's even a website I know, I want to say it might be called ouramerica.org or something, that has the beginnings of this celebration, and you'll see the first picture you'll see is a white family holding a big American flag. But there, you'll eventually hear there's going to be talk about organizing so that the real folks of this country will be represented and can tell their stories. So I think, I mean, unfortunately, there is a lot of talk and a lot of writing, but we each need to choose our way, and we need to speak the truth. We need to, like I'm an abolitionist, I say dismantle the system. I say reparations. I say there's a lot of things. I say defund the police. I say there are things that we need to not just tweak. We need to say what you're doing is not enough for us. We demand more. We built this, and we want it to reflect what we are due. You know, we want to have the life that we deserve. I mean, I just think it's the more we say that and let people know, because we can get. It's like when I was in jail, people would say to me, "Oh, wait till you get to the prison in Raleigh. You're gonna like the prison because it's bigger. You get to go to class sometimes. You get to wear some of your own clothes, and the food's better." We have come to believe that a bigger prison is better. That
Wow.
we are really free. And so this emancipation, we need to understand what freedom really is and demand, just as you say, reparations.
Thank you. We're going to close it out right here because we have to go, but thank you for your questions. I want to give these three authors a chance to, in like 1 or 2 sentences, max.
1 or 2 sentences.
1 or 2 sentences max about what you think this book is about, and what do you hope readers walk away from by reading this book?
I hope people understand what the woman, the young lady said is true. The elephant in the room is there if we don't address it. And more importantly, the onus is not on us. This is not just a conversation that we have to have. My white friends always say, well, when race things come up, they call me. I say, why are you calling me? Call your grandmother. Call your uncle. Call somebody in your family. Ask them what they think. Ask them what they think is going to make it better. Because the problem is, we talk about policing in jails. The jailer is affected as much as the person who's incarcerated when you have those things. So the conversation is not just on us to continue it, but and again, I have confidence that we, as black people, as African descendants, we always will be here fighting relentlessly.
Thank you. Patrice?
Oh my God, 2 sentences.
Yeah, well.
Well, I do hope that when people read this, they will be, if you're feeling down, you'll be re-inspired. You'll understand how much we have fought, but how many people are now fighting. When you're at home cooking, somebody's fighting. Mm-hmm. You know, when you're sitting at church, somebody's marching. When you are on your knees praying even, there is somebody out there with their fist in the air. So we need to understand that, but we are all doing what we can do. And you need to find that part and be determined that every day there is something that you can do. And we need to make those demands. Like I like to make demands that I think are just, I can't cuss because they are filming this, but are impossible. Somebody else might say are impossible. Well, we didn't get to this point by believing that something was impossible. And so I'm going to demand that you do something that you might think is impossible. But that's what I want you to do, because I deserve that, and we deserve that at this point. And to move this stuff forward, we need to make those kinds of demands, and we need to stand behind them, and we need to spread them, like you say, call your mama, call your uncle, call your whatever, to get them to move off the dime, do what we can. But yeah, buy the book, first of all. Read it and be inspired.
All right, and Keith,
Okay.
final word.
Okay.
not gonna be two
By the way,
sentences.
paperback will be out in May.
We
But I
can't
said
do
this
that.
before. I think this book is about normalcy, what's normal in the United States of America. And so, what would we do? What would we do about it? I have had this conversation with a former colleague, at least of the three of us, who's a columnist at the Post. And every time, even now that neither of us, well, he's still there. I'm not there anymore. When I still communicate with him, and this comes up, he stops me and he says, unless you, and he says, unless you're talking about the end of the capitalist economic system, don't talk to me about this. Which is the same conclusion, by the way, that Martin Luther King Jr. had reached before he was killed. And so, you know, no, I'm not trying to overthrow the government, in case y'all are listening.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is, there's some things that are just they're so interconnected in the economic system in which we live. And unless you, and unless you are willing to do what's necessary to do something about that, again, as Martin Luther King Jr. was about to really start pressing people about before he was killed, probably no coincidence, unless you start, I don't know that we're not going to stay in this cycle as this young man who was over there who left said,
Yeah.
2 steps forward, 3 steps back, because this economic system it thrives on that kind of thing, and it can happen in that kind of system. Not that it can't happen. Not that it can't happen in other economic systems either. But anyway.
I
there you
know,
go.
when people always say to me, well, you're talking about socialism. I'm like, no, I'm talking about something that doesn't even exist ever.
Yeah.
It never has.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Patrice Gaines, Nick Charles, and Keith Harrison, authors of Say Their Names, How Black Lives Came to Matter in America. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Keith. Thank you.
Good to see you.